All right, so before I dive into this, before I light the fuse on this bad boy, let me get this out of the way. So you're probably asking, James, why is your skin all red and blotchy and why is your face like that? Well, I just got out of a hot shower and it's like this for 30 minutes. Just the heat and the steam does it to my skin. It didn't used to do it until I moved to Michigan. So I'm just going to blame Michigan for it because that's the easiest thing to do. But yeah, let's dive into this because the feminists, dude, they gonna hate this, bro.
She's respected as the greatest feminist intellectual of the 20th century, and she was super influential. And in a 1970s interview with Betty Friedan, she said, I don't believe that society should give women the opportunity or the choice to stay home and be mothers, because if we do, they're all going to pick that.
Not just third wave feminism, all feminism may have been not just a mistake, but a very evilly influenced movement. And it's antithetical to all forms of true Christianity. Look, full disclosure, friends of the show, have become friends with them recently, having had them on the show. Yeah. And you're probably familiar with Andrew Wilson. Rachel Wilson is incredibly well-read on the history of feminism. And she just appeared on the Joe Rogan show last night. And you could tell that Joe Rogan was really sitting and he was just captivated because he was hearing some things that he had never really heard before. She was expounding on some of the things that were discussed in her book, which, by the way, I highly recommend. It's Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation. I highly recommend it. It's a very short read. You can do the audiobook, but it's worth it. It seems like one of those things that's clickbait, but it's not.
Yeah, I'm actually reading that book right now, and it is really good. But yeah, most people, they were taught that feminism, it was just this grassroots movement for equal rights, but it wasn't. It wasn't that at all. And if you read Rachel's book, she really dives deep into the history, and she lays it out beautifully, honestly. It's a good book. But yeah, she points out that the feminist movement had a lot of ideological influences and elite support that conveniently none of us were told about, right? Of course, they left that out, glossed over it or altered it to make it sound, to give it good PR, right? Use Edward Bernays to sell it to the masses. And one of the themes that she points out in the book is that the early feminist circles, they were tied to these broader intellectual movements, right, of the late 19th and early 20th century, and they included a few things. They included utopian social theories, spiritualism, and radical social reform. And the point that she makes in the book isn't that every single woman that was involved knew this, but the point is that the leadership and the intellectual direction of the feminist movement, it came from the top. It came from people with much bigger ideological goals than simply equal rights. And and it is, when I was a Christian, this always annoyed me because I saw this in the Protestant realm and also in the Catholic realm. Because I remember going to Catholic groups, to people's houses, and women in those groups, they would bring up feminism and they try to merge feminism with Catholicism, and it's completely antithetical. It's laughable, really. So that just shows how deep feminism has infected our culture, especially in Christianity. And the reason why is that it's so antithetical is because Christianity, it centers around the family unit. Traditionally, society traditionally is the family is the center of society, right? Husband, wife, children. So the family is it's the primary institution for society as far as moral authority and the stability of a society. That's how it's maintained, is through the family. And then you see that in feminist theory, especially in those later waves, they openly criticize family. they throw around those buzzwords of it being patriarchal and restrictive, all that BS, and they would frame motherhood, especially marriage and motherhood, as being the barriers to female liberation. And when you look at it through that lens, then you understand why it's antithetical to Christian values and Christian ethics. And it's this the feminist ideology is a collectivist, atheistic ideology. So, yeah.
Right. She sources it meticulously. So she was on Joe Rogan's show. And I will tell you this. I had, back in the day, there was a lady named Karen Strawn. You can go back and see some interviews
Love Karen Strawn.
with her maybe in 2014. She really not only influenced me, but informed me on women's suffrage, on women getting the right to vote, and why it was a scam from the get-go. And I remember, let me ask you this. Do you guys ever have those numbers, stats, historical facts that you hear, you verify that they're true, but they're so difficult to believe because of how you've been conditioned that you have to consistently go back to them? I get that all the time. I used to get that with Donald Trump, closing down the border, like 95% reductions in border crossings. I'm like, there's no way that's possible. There's no way that could happen in a year. I know it to be true, but it's hard. That's why you can't always trust your gut. Same thing happened with me, I think, in 2014 when I learned that the overwhelming majority of women did not want the vote. It was hugely unpopular, which brings us to the first clip of Rachel Wilson on Joe Rogan's show.
I would think, okay, well, I think women should have the right to vote.
Yeah, really quickly before we get into this, what he was talking about, that is a real phenomenon. When you hear the same narrative long enough, anything that you hear after that contradicts it, it feels impossible to believe, right? Even if it's backed by sources. You see that all the time. And the immediate reaction that most people have, it's just this sheer disbelief because it scrambles their brain. It contradicts what they were conditioned to believe in. It messes with their programming. And because that's the thing. Historical narratives, they get either simplified or completely rewritten over time in these nice and clean moral stories, right? With heroes and villains and liberation and oppression. It's to tug at your heartstrings. And that's why they insert them into movies and television, right? That's why it's called television programming. So, but yeah, once those narratives, they become embedded in education and culture through those different mediums, then people, they just stop questioning them. But not me. I question everything. All right, let's get into it.
Which brings us to the first clip of Rachel Wilson on Joe Rogan's show.
I would think, okay, well, I think women should have the right to vote. They're human beings. They live here. There's laws that are being...
Women really didn't want to be involved in politics. They let them vote on whether they wanted the vote. The biggest referendum was in Massachusetts. So they let women vote on whether they wanted the vote in a referendum. Of the women that showed up, not a lot of them showed up. It was a fairly smallish number, but of the thousands that showed up to vote, only 4% wanted suffrage on the ballot.
That's crazy.
Only 4%. So guess what Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony did after that? All the pro-suffrage leaders, they banned women from voting on whether they wanted to vote.
Oh, my God.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. And then men gave women the right to vote.
That's right.
Think about that for a second. Now, that's a small study. We've given you numbers in the past where it's anywhere from 70 to 80-something% if you try and take the totality of data as far as women who were against the vote. She explains why that was the case. I've gotten into that. But you do need to know that top line number. The overwhelming majority of women did not want the vote because of what it came with, because they felt that they had influence, and because they didn't want women to be ruined through the process of politics. And they thought they would lose some influence and leverage. And here's something else. This transitions to, okay, so that's the case, but people will say it's a good thing that they have the vote. And
right, and that's the uncomfortable pill that these staunch feminists have to swallow, but they will probably refuse to. Like I said, with it conflicts with their programming, so they will be in complete and utter disbelief. But that is true. A large number of women, they opposed suffrage because, yeah, they believe that political involvement, what it would do is it would drag women into the ugliness of partisan politics, and it would weaken their influence that they already had in the family and in community life. And some women at the time, they argued that that political power had already flowed indirectly through fathers, husbands, and sons, and they feared that a formal political participation it would fundamentally change social dynamics. Crazy. They were onto something. So, yeah, those women, they saw that voting, it meant entering the state's political machine, right? And the smart women, they believed that their influence inside the family and in the community, it was stronger, way stronger, than participating directly in politics. And the concern that they had about women being politically mobilized was that it would reorganize society around political power rather than family relationships. And valid, because that's exactly what happened. And yeah, funny enough, it wasn't men that were standing in the way of women's right to vote. It was other women. Crazy how that works. So, and that fact alone, it flips the entire story that people grew up hearing on its head. I mean, just ask any feminist about suffrage, and ask them, well, who held women back? And they'll all tell you it was men. Well, wrong. It wasn't. And now, I'm an anarchist, so I don't think voting is helpful at all. And so I would never, you'll never catch me justifying state involvement in anything. Just throwing that out there. But that's a story for another day. But yeah, let's get into this.
Feminism
back into
right,
this
has been a good thing overall. Choice. Who could be against choice? Well, Rachel got into that, and I think articulated this pretty well. Most women would choose to be stay-at-home moms, something that feminists proactively they denied the vote for the vote. They also wanted to prevent women from having the option to stay home. So women right now, if you say, well, I can't have it all, I have to make a choice, you can thank feminists who wanted to ensure that you couldn't stay home with your kids, but you'd outsource that.
You asked me, like, do women really want to be in the workplace, or are they only kind of really choosing the girl boss stuff?
That's a giant generalization anyway.
Right, of course it is.
Obviously, some women do and some women don't, and there's a lot of women who naturally, maternally want to have children and want to have a family.
Simone de Beauvoir, arguably the biggest feminist of second wave, the French intellectual who was buddies with Jean-Paul Sartre, and they got in trouble for grooming underage kids and seducing them and all kinds.
Dude, what the heck? They always are involved with that stuff. Always. There's always a bunch of those sickos in these movements.
The crazy stuff. But she's respected as the greatest feminist intellectual of the 20th century, and she was super influential. And in a 1970s interview with Betty Friedan, she said, I don't believe that society should give women the opportunity or the choice to stay home and be mothers, because if we do, they're all going to pick that. And I don't think it should be an option. So
oh my God.
it was the view of the feminists that, and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton said that. They said,
remember Susan B. Anthony? She's on that coin. Yeah, I remember her, but that's all I really knew about her when I was a kid was just the coin thing.
We would have never passed suffrage had it not been for men. If it was ever left up to women alone, we would have never passed suffrage. They would have never gone for it. They don't want liberation.
And I really hope that if you're watching this, and I know we have plenty of women who watch, but I hope that you sit down and watch this with your wife or your significant other, if you're a man, because there are some truths that are really
or your partner, right?
Uncomfortable. And that's something we need to break through. If we have this conversation, actually the 19th may have been a mistake in a lot of ways. People go, whoa, you must be a showman. Hold on. And actually, not just third wave feminism, all feminism may have been not just a mistake, but a very evilly influenced movement.
Yeah, dude. Real quick, that quote from Simone de Beauvoir. First time I heard her name was in 10 Things I Hate About You, right? With Julia Stiles' character, because she was a raging feminist. But I think that's the most revealing thing of the whole discussion here, because once again, feminism, their PR, their marketing tactic was framed around choice, right? Choice, equality, all that good stuff. But here you have one of the most influential feminist thinkers openly saying that women shouldn't even be given the option to stay home because many would choose it. That's wild. And that's because these feminist thinkers, these quasies, they viewed traditional motherhood. It wasn't simply a choice, but it was an obstacle to the broader social transformation that they were advocating for. So, yeah.
And it's antithetical to all forms of true Christianity when you understand its roots. It's an uncomfortable conversation to have. It's kind of a third rail, but we gotta be honest about it. And that's why I think this conversation was incredibly valuable, and I do think that it's going to become a reference piece. Here's another one. Rachel talks about this. You've heard me discuss this. You've heard me cite those people, by the way, and change my mind. Simone de Beauvoir was sort of the godmother of modern gender theory, though it still existed within a binary before we got to John Money and all of these things. Rachel goes on to talk about how feminists like Margaret Sanger, who I've discussed, and Nazis, kind of one and the same, they were eugenicists. And they decided to make a part of that eugenics plan, not just abortion, we all talk about that, but birth control may be a blind spot for a lot of people.
She was getting paid by the Rockefeller Foundation and promoted by people like...
Yep, Rockefeller Foundation, boom. And that's also brought up that they also helped establish the medical system, the educational system, everything.
H.G. Wells, who she was also having an affair with. They're all a bunch of creepers, Joe, I'm telling you. He was a...
Dude, they are. They're all a bunch of creeps.
eugenicist who loved the idea of millions of abortions a year.
H.G. Wells, the War of the Worlds
Yep.
guy, was a eugenicist.
Yep. Feminism was instrumental in that. That's actually where the birth control pill came from as well. Mm-hmm. Margaret Sanger, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Kaiser Wilhelm
Who was incredibly racist.
Foundation, and a lot of Nazi scientists are the ones who started synthesizing human hormones to make birth control pills. And the way they sold that was they said, look, we know abortion's very unpopular. People don't like it. It's a very terrible thing that we have to do. We have to do it because we don't want all these babies. Ugh. But, if you let us have the birth control pill and you make it like widely available and socially acceptable, abortion will be a thing of the past.
Yeah, that's the key word, socially acceptable. That's where the Sigmund Freud and Edward Bernays come into it to sell it to the masses, to dispense the propaganda for these movements.
Nobody will need one ever again. That's how it was marketed and sold.
Which many were pushed by these three-letter agencies. One in particular, I'm not going to say, but you can guess. It starts with a C.
To the world, and it sounds right. It sounds reasonable. Maybe it's better. Maybe it's better just to prevent all the pregnancies, and then we don't have to worry about abortions. But here we are in 2026. You can get abortion, or you can get birth control pills for $4 at Walmart.
And abortion is now just an alternative to birth control for most women.
You can go down to your local health department in your county and get them for free if you're under a certain income status, and we still
or another form of birth control.
Have, well, at least before they overturned Roe v. Wade, we still had about 1 million abortions a year in this country.
Yeah. What are we at now? Like over 60 million or something total throughout the decades. But the birth control pill, and and it overlaps heavily with eugenics, dude. And at that time, eugenics, it was supported by a lot of those prominent intellectuals and institutions, Rockefellers, Margaret Sanger, all of them, and that overlap Dude, it destroys the story that was taught about the origins of reproductive politics. Just forget everything that you were taught by mainstream society. It's all wrong. And when I think about it, I remember reading H.G. Wells as a kid. I had a few of his books lying around. We were exposed to these people constantly throughout our lives without knowing the real truth, because they didn't want to teach those parts, because they wanted us to believe a certain narrative. And so, yeah, what we were taught was either altered or completely omitted from the official narrative. And feminists, they don't really like it when you bring up Margaret Sanger, because it shines a light on how dark their movement is, especially with Planned Parenthood, and it shows you what their actual agenda is, which is eugenics. And you probably remember this if you're old enough. Back in 1992, when Bill Clinton, he said, when he was trying to bridge the gap with the debate on abortion, right? The safe, legal, and rare. Remember that? And that is evidence. If you trace that back to what we see now, that's just more evidence of the tiptoe of tyranny that we've witnessed through these decades. These movements they're always incremental, but then once they've gotten close enough to the finish line, then they accelerate. That's just how they work.
And that's super important, isn't it? We have, the roots of feminism. And she does get into the occult, by the way, and a lot of the spiritualism. And some of it isn't necessarily evil in the way that you would think. It's just degenerate.
Oh, it's wildly degenerate. I highly recommend reading the book, because you find out the levels of degeneracy that are rooted, that feminism is rooted in. It's wild.
It really was sort of people selling snake oil. They knew that they were scamming folks. She's very good at sort of outlining that in the book. So you have the roots of it. All right, it's antithetical to you as a Christian. You cannot be a Christian feminist.
You hear that, Christians? I'm not a Christian anymore, but for all you Christians out there, you can't be a feminist and a Christian at the same time. You got to pick one, okay?
It's not a thing. And then we look at the results. The results are bad. The results are worse. Everything that women have been promised was a lie. The results have been the opposite from feminism. And I want to be clear, this is not just third wave feminism. From its inception, and that was the goal. And that's because feminism is definitively, this is objectively true. It's a subset of Marxist ideology.
Yep.
That was part of the Marxist playbook, right? Divide and conquer. You're not going to have the numbers unless you break up the family and you have women becoming nagging harpies, to be clear. And I will tell you this, I don't really take part. We do that.
Right. So, and then I'm going to stop it right there, because that's really the meat and potatoes of it. And yeah, the final talking point here is the link to the Marxist ideology. So, and this is precisely why Karen Strong, she refers to feminism as socialism in panties. So feminism, Marxism, socialism, communism, they're all collectivist ideologies. They're all party crashers at the same party. They all call for the abolition of the family, because, like I said earlier, the family is it's the one traditional institution that stands in the way of progress. It stands in the way of their broader agenda, their broader ideological agenda. And that's because family is the structure that preserves social order. It is. And the Marxists, they used feminism as a tool to accomplish that core tenet of their ideology. And so that's where I'll leave it. I've lit this fuse, and now I'm just going to walk away. And I'll see you guys on the next one.